Welcome everyone to ModX Network Voices. I'm Ryan Smith. I'm joined here by Ivan Rupnik. Ivan?
Hi Ryan, how's it going?
Good, thanks for coming, appreciate it. And today's guest on Network Voices is Greg Sloditskie. Greg is a longtime friend and acquaintance of Ivan and I, and he has graciously accepted to come and talk about his journey. Greg, we'd like for you to first just introduce yourself a little bit and who you are and your background, then we'll get into some questions. Take it away, Greg.
Okay, thanks for the invitation. My name is Greg Sloditskie. I currently live in Walnut Creek, California. I'm originally from central Pennsylvania, which is a little hotbed of modular and mobile housing. So that's how I wound up in this industry. I graduated from Penn State with an engineering degree in 1984, and I'm sorry, 1983. And the first thing that happened was the bottom dropped out of the engineering market, and my first job was selling running shoes in an outdoor store. And the first industry that responded happened to be prefab, which I was surrounded by. So I have 36 years of experience in the prefab industry. I've worked as an engineer in the modular, mobile, and panelized sectors. Within those three sectors, I've worked on single family homes from the simple to the crazy, multifamily and commercial buildings, dormitories, hotels, and assisted living. 90% of my experience is in wood construction, wood modular or wood panelized. That would include SIPs. Another 10% of my experience is in light gauge steel or light gauge steel and concrete. Most of my experience is in the US, but I've also worked with clients on 6 continents. My career started at Ritzcraft, like I said, in 1984. At the time, drawings were prepared by hand. CAD was still in its infancy and it was very expensive. That changed in the late 80s, and I was responsible for transitioning Ritzcraft from hand drawing to CAD. So I worked in AutoCAD until about 2005. Then I transitioned to Revit. Now I can't imagine preparing a set of documents or modeling a concept without Revit or SketchUp or some combination of the two. Lately, I've been providing engineering services to GCs, architects, and modular manufacturers. Most of my efforts are focused on the multifamily sector lately. This can take the form of plan reviews, design advice, feasibility studies, material and code research. My current client base is located mostly in the US, but I also have Asian, European, and Australian clients. So that's where I stand as of today.
That's really impressive, Greg. And it's interesting that your entry into the modular industry coincided with actually the founding of the Modular Building Institute, which really says a lot about how long you've been involved in the industry.
I was not even aware of that. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, we're a little we're dorkier than anyone else in this industry, at least. But one of the things that so one of the things we'd love to start off our chat about is because I bring up the modular building industry because one of the things that MBI supported for us was looking at obstacles. Asked us to look at obstacles to the growth of market share in the industry, and then one of the things we keep trying to understand is really the kind of systematic challenges to the adoption of what seems to be like a no-brainer approach to construction, right? All the different flavors of offsite. So in your experience, both in you mentioned 6 continents, many clients, and multiple years, what are some of the key persistent obstacles to the growth of what seems to be a really superior form of construction?
So I think I have basically 7 topics, and I'll lay out the topics and try to also throw out my 2 cents as to how I think they can be resolved. So my 7 major points are, I'll walk through these, but are standardization, factory capability, complexity, knowledge of the stakeholders, regulatory problems, material science, and material usage. So I'll walk through those one at a time. And so standardization is important, but it's not something that's typically done in the building industry. So, I mean, you wouldn't expect Toyota to build one car with a different engine just for you. but that's what developers and GCs expect a modular company to do. So I'm not suggesting we return to mobile home days. I'm just saying that the pendulum has swung too far in the anything goes direction. If you really want to reap the benefits of factory production, you have to be willing to accept some level of standardization. Otherwise, each new project becomes an R&D exercise. So, I mean, even within standardization, there's still, you know, opportunities for good design, but you just have to understand that there has to be some standardization, because the factory just can't keep reinventing the wheel. Number two, factory capability. I've worked with modular factories all across the US and the world. What one factory considers impossible or difficult, another might perform as a standard practice. I've seen many projects fail because the client basically forced the factory out of their comfort zone. And the factory was willing to do it because they've got people to employ and they want to keep their doors open. So as designers and engineers and architects, you have to be sensitive to those needs. You can't force that round peg into the, you know, square hole. Complexity. When I first started in the modular mobile industry, subcontractors working in a modular or a mobile factory that was rare. So, but nowadays, because things are so complex and so specialized, now modular factories are having to employ their own subs within the factory, because the mechanical and electrical and sprinklers, and it's just, you know, home automation, all those things have gotten so complex that the factory now has to coordinate all those things, you know, under their own roof. So that's a new challenge to be overcome. The knowledge to the stakeholders becomes important. And I mean, I sometimes joke that architects and designers who think they understand modular are almost more dangerous than those that don't, because they think they understand things, but they think they understand them well enough that they can change the rules, but they really don't. So one of the things I suggest to new designers and new architects, and this is again something Toyota used to do, is anyone who's really serious about it, spend a couple days at a modular factory just walking around before you ever pick up a marker or click a mouse. You can't get it from reading books or watching videos. You really need to go live it for a while and see why things are done certain ways. And once you understand those things, you can make more intelligent design decisions. The regulatory side. So the modular industry is regulated at the state level in most states. In theory, this means that the local inspector and the building department have no jurisdiction beyond the fieldwork. Theory is the key word. The reality is that building departments and inspectors sometimes try to enforce local codes and requirements anyway. So fighting with them just slows down the process. So most modular companies comply if the requests are not too difficult or expensive. So this kind of defeats the purpose, but it's the reality that we live in. The mobile home industry has a national code, and it dates back to 1976. So, and that code is recognized in all 50 states. So they don't have that, mobile home industry doesn't have that problem. There's been talk of a national modular code, and I'm sure MBI is all over this, but there's been talk of it, but in my 35 years, it's never really materialized because states don't really want to give up their authority. It's, you know, the United States has the word united in it, but on some levels, it's really like 50 different countries. Material science is the part that I'm probably most passionate about, because in my opinion, material science is the limiting factor for modular construction. The offsite industry relies on traditional building materials and methods. You won't find any materials in an offsite factory that don't exist on a traditional construction site. It's the same windows, same doors, same gypsum. If the industry really wants to grow, there needs to be some basic research in material science so that we can get out of this. If you think back in history, you know, Sullivan's Wainwright building is seen as the prototypical skyscraper. And that came about because elevators were perfected and steel construction was
Fireproofing.
perfected. Fireproofing, right. All those things came together at that time in the late 1800s.
Yeah.
I think the modular industry needs a similar material. I mean, material science breakthrough. Otherwise, and my cohorts will hate me for saying this, but otherwise, modular construction is just stick building in a warehouse in a slightly more efficient manner. There's a Dutch company called Wickelhaus. They produce these cabins that are made by wrapping 24 layers of cardboard around a steel form.
Yeah.
And the resulting volumes are then plugged together to form a structure. So does this have any scalable application in the US? No, but it's an example of the type of thinking that the industry needs.
Yeah.
It's also an example of a process that can only be done in a factory.
Right.
You can stick build modules. You couldn't stick build this thing, but so that's the kind of thinking. Gypsum's another one.
Yeah.
It's very labor intensive and it limits the production line speed and the factory's output. There are alternatives out there like Fermacell, which is owned by James Hardie and used throughout Europe. But it comes in sheets that are 8 feet by 20 feet, which would be, think of all the seams that you can eliminate and all the finishing you can eliminate. But getting it approved in the US to ASTM standards has been a real chore. I've been working on it with those people for probably over a year by now. And I'd have to say in the current economic situation, that process might be dead for a while.
Yeah.
Another thing to consider is material usage. So does the modular industry use materials in a more efficient manner compared to site building? Yes, no doubt. But the modular industry requires a greater quantity of materials compared to conventional construction. I saw a guy post this on a blog one day. So I thought, let me do a bill of material and see if this guy's right. So I did. Modular construction uses 40% more framing than a conventional building of the same size. And it's the redundant walls and the ceiling. And again, this goes back to materials research. If we could build a different way, maybe we could get rid of some of those problems.
Well, so it's great, Greg, that you've really you've been in the trenches and you're able to identify all of the kind of sticking points. So we've also seen some of these, from a bit more of the outside, some of these obstacles. But we've also seen people, in other countries address them. So, gypsum is something that is not really used, for example, in Japan for obvious reasons. Standardization is something that, Sweden, Japan seem to understand. Vertical integration, whether it's within a company or through a kind of consortium. But do you have, so you've seen in the US though, for some reason, there's certain entrenched behaviors that seem to have not changed in the last 40 years. What do you see as, if you could talk to building products companies, if you could talk to HUD, if you could talk to MBI, what are some things that you see, that really could help overcome these challenges? What are some changes that, where would you even, you described material science seems very clear. That's one, and we have a similar experience with talking to some of the building products companies and seem to understand that gypsum plus modules moving down the road doesn't make a lot of sense either. It's like putting gypsum in an earthquake every time you build something. But is there other things you can see that are pretty clear agendas forward in overcoming these challenges?
I think the industry organizations like MBI could be pretty key to something like that, because if we could get some kind of, maybe not so much a national modular code, but at least some kind of relief that all these little building departments don't act like kingdoms and just get in the way. And in some cases, if just the political people would just stand up for the process that they've enacted. A lot of times, some local official will try to do something like that. You'll go back to the state or whatever the authority is, and they really don't give you much help. And that's the reason why the modular industry has just said, okay, we'll just try to do it. So it kind of defeats the purpose. And I also think that if we could work with companies if we could be taken seriously as an industry, I think is maybe what I'm trying to say is, so if you go to USG, they kind of look at the modular industry as like, oh, you guys are just a small percentage of our business. I don't feel like I get a whole lot of love from them. But if they could treat us more seriously, maybe we could develop some type of gypsum product that was more friendly to the industry, or drying compounds that work better on a production line and travel better down the road, those kinds of things. And again, I think MBI going to a USG or one of the gypsum companies as an industry organization could help out a lot.
And that's an interesting point. Sorry, just I mean, you know, for example, if USG again sees it as it's the 3%, 2% of market share, why would they change? In fact, on the other hand, you could say, well, USG likes conventional construction because buying a sheet of gypsum and then throwing away half of it is really good business for them, right? Because of conventional construction. Why, you know, that. But then what you just said, which I think is an important point, if MBI goes and says, look, you know, USG, like gypsum, is both an opportunity and an obstacle for us. We're either going to move away from it and we see growth, or we're not. So I think that's a really important point too. We've seen that in terms, not just fragmentation in terms of the industry, but still a bit of fragmentation in terms of lobbying and in terms of big moves.
Right. Yeah, agreed. And I also think that the USG, I'm not picking on USG, it's just the one.
It's a good example.
But I mean, I think that they've got to see the trend is going this way. Mm-hmm. So I think they probably might have more friendly reception to it nowadays than it used to be. We
have a hunch too.
That's great, Greg.
But I still think this whole material science thing, that's bugged me for a long time. That there's, you know, I've given factory tours, and sometimes people will come out and ask the question, so what's different about this? And I'll just laugh at nothing really. It's the same. It's the same thing you see in a site. It's just done in a more efficient manner. But if you want to get to the next level, you've got to come up with some new material, I think, to eliminate this redundancy and speed up the production line.
We have, you know, as a segue into the next topic, Greg, Ivan and I, and you have seen quite a few factories abroad outside the United States. Let's take Sweden as an example, that do use traditional materials in their production line, but the way in which they think about organizing the process of manufacturing is very smart, right? It's very different than building in a warehouse. It's automation in an appropriate automated place. They're using gypsum wallboard, sure, but they're doing it in panels, and then they're taking those panels as 2D elements into a 3D box. And there are tack stations, and just seems like a more productive use of the labor. I wondered if you might talk about your experience with regards to automation. The other side of this is the United States seems to be infatuated with automation as well, that, you know, robots will solve all our problems. And I think that a lot of that comes out of the IT sector, and investors also like to see robots. Just, you know, want to get your feeling on volumetric modular construction in the factory and its relationship to automation, and what you see are important ways to think about automation, and also tactical approaches to implementing automation in the factory.
Well, one of the reasons why you haven't really seen automation in a modular factory is it goes back to the drywall drying issue. So the factory's speed is not limited by how fast they can build walls, floors, and ceilings. The factory's speed is limited by how fast the drywall can be finished. That's really the limiting factor. So they never really invested much in automation, because it doesn't matter if you pile up, you know, floors and framed elements, the line's not moving any faster than the drywall is drying. But nowadays things are changing, because modular factories are having the same problem that site builders have, which is they can't get labor. So now automation, they're starting to be looked at in a different way. It's a way to not replace people, but just to provide labor that they can't get. And although, and like you said, automation is the shiny object. You know, everybody thinks about robots and it looks really cool, but until you really understand your process, you're just you're just automating chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And a factory, like there's a factory out here in California, Factory OS, and they've taken their approach. We're not really going to go after automation for like the first year or two. We want to really understand our process and know where automation makes sense. I've seen factories where people have gone out and spent tens of millions of dollars and loaded a factory up with all kinds of equipment that isn't productive. It just, a lot of times it's sitting, and sometimes it even goes unused. And then years later, they'll say, oh, I wish we wouldn't have bought that piece of equipment, or I wish we would have done it differently. But if you look at, like you mentioned the Swedes, I'm more familiar with the Germans, but the way the Germans have done it is they started out with a manual process, and as they understood their process, they automated, and they automated some more, and they automated some more. Unfortunately, what happens is people go on these tours of German panelized factories, and they see all this equipment, but what they don't understand is that was years to get there. Yeah, they didn't go out and just do that overnight. So, I mean, if I was giving somebody advice on automation, I think the one that you can do regardless of process is get a 5-axis saw, some kind of CNC saw. I think that's a good investment. That's kind of process agnostic. You know, you can use that to feed the factory. But beyond that, I think you really have to understand your process first and wring out all the little inefficiencies before you just dive into automation. That there are plenty of ways that you can help people do their job better through, you know, tables that tilt and vacuum lifts and things like that you don't typically see in a US factory that you do see in a Swedish or a German factory. Those kinds of things I think would be very helpful.
Yeah, and Greg, in addition to speed and labor, one of the things we seem to notice is also that obviously automation, incremental, exactly what you described. It also does help in terms of tolerances, especially in the wood systems. In Sweden, for example, it allows for higher finishes. Do you see that as a potential also value in automation for the US market? So beyond cost, beyond speed, and
Here's one that's a dirty little secret when it comes to automation. Is I worked in a panelized factory that relied heavily on automation. The lumber that you see in Europe is beautiful. It's usually finger jointed. It's beautiful. The lumber that you get in the United States, those machines have a hard time with it.
Working with.
Because it's too twisted and warped. And I remember I worked at a factory, and we were going to send some demo lumber over so that it could be used on the equipment manufacturers' machines in Germany to prove out the system. And the comment I got back from the Germans when we sent them a picture of what we were going to send them, their comment, and I quote, was, "That's firewood." And,
But well, so you're describing the obstacle to using the machines, and we've seen that too. But on the other hand, is there, if we were to, I don't know, somehow resolve that issue or address that issue, do you see that there's other benefits, again, like higher tolerances, higher level of finishes, higher precision?
No, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. Actually, the factory I'm talking about, we started importing finger jointed lumber, and that solved the problem.
Yeah.
Because we found that it wasn't that much of a cost difference, and
there you go.
All the lumber that you had to throw away, it worked out. So I think you have to do what they're doing, which is use manufactured materials like they're using.
Yeah, engineered wood seems to be solving it for a lot of factories.
Yeah.
So related to automation is three-dimensional modeling, Greg, and we're seeing more and more modular factories, the mom and pop modular factories in the United States, starting to invest in 3D modeling, in particular Revit platforms. There's always the question about design software and its interoperability with manufacturing software, certainly. But what has been your experience in the factories that either you've consulted with or worked for and set up, and the acknowledgement that three-dimensional modeling needs to be invested in, and the importance of that? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Like a lot of things, trends go from the West Coast to the East Coast. And when I moved to the West Coast, I already knew how to use Revit, but I really wasn't you know, like proficient at it. But once I got to the West Coast, I realized that everybody uses Revit out here, and that's the baseline. And now I'm starting to see it migrate to the East Coast, and some of my East Coast clients have contacted me about that. Like, hey, can you help us out with this Revit thing? And honestly, I can't imagine doing a set of drawings nowadays without using it, because especially in modular, because in modular is so pre-con dependent that you need to work all that stuff out up front. You know, it's not like normal construction where the mechanical guy shows up and says, you know, I can't really route it the way it's shown on the MEP drawings. I think I'm going to have to go over there instead. You can't do that. It all has to be worked out because everything's closed up. So I think it's critical. I mean, if you want to save some money and not plunk down, you know, 6 figures on Revit software for a lot of seats, I think a way to do it is kind of what I do in my own office, which is I start out with SketchUp or something like that, just to get a concept dialed in, and I can, you know, share it with my clients. And then once I've got it nailed down, then I commit to Revit. But I just don't see. I think the days of AutoCAD are over for the modular industry. I don't see how they can do it without using 3D software.
And how do they get that to interface with, you know, the factory floor, even if they're not automating? You know, automation's another question, but how do they get that to interface with the factory floor? Because there seems to be a lot of scope gaps that emerge when you've got, you know, labor on the floor looking at drawings that were produced upstairs in the engineering office. You know, how do we bridge that gap?
One of my clients back east is starting to do more with getting away from paper and going more to iPads and monitors at workstations to try to eliminate that, because one of the problems with paper is you don't know if that guy's drawing is up to date, or if it's had, you know, or if he or she has changed something on it. So going to more of a digital world, you're guaranteed that they're getting the best information, which is also another selling point for automation, because in the automation route, it's going straight from the file straight to the machine, and the person is really just following the instructions that are on the screen, which came directly from the design software.
Yeah, so, you know, when we were at Factory OS visiting, we did find it interesting that even though they're in the process of analyzing where to automate right now, but they have instituted manufacturing thinking already in the connection of the design office to the factory floor by using these monitors. And, you know, manufactons help them sort of upskill a little bit in that area. So I just want to make it clear to our listeners that, you know, in factories, you know, I'm sure as you go down this path, you may not want to jump 100% into automation, but there are lots of things that could be done from the software arena and 3-dimensional modeling to connect with the factory floor and make that process more efficient and root out any sort of the waste and errors that are made along that path.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah. Maybe as a way to close out the question set too, just because we just brought up Factory OS, which is still a relatively new player, and especially in your experience, Greg, with these folks. So, I mean, based on especially some of the more recent additions to the modular industry, do you have some general advice for, you know, particularly manufacturers or maybe more integrated companies starting out? What are some of the key things to think about?
Actually, I really like what Factory OS did, because they've, you know, it's a marriage of holiday development and mechanic construction. So
contractor. Yeah.
So, you know, very often what happens in the modular world is the modular company has a client and the client has a GC, and then the modular company winds up selling to the GC, but the GC doesn't always have a whole lot of interest in understanding what they've been told in the pre-con phase. So a lot of projects fall apart because it comes down to the, you know, the old change order bit.
Communication.
Well, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. But if you can give the GC a real financial stake and an incentive to make it work, I think that's the key to these projects really being successful. And that's why I see more companies are going to start looking like Factory OS than the mom and pop shops that you've seen in the past.
Mm-hmm. But also, again, like I think to your point, we've seen that too, is that while especially modular, the volumetric modules do look like big building products, they're not. I mean, in a way, they're part of a process, and you can't expect a module to show up like a window on a construction site. It requires more integration, and and even when you standardize, it's still a custom product. So to your point, I think what you're alluding to also with Factor S, it's a new model for the modular industry. We've seen that where it's a developer / GC coming into actually having some experience with modular and then deciding to set up modular manufacturing facilities, which is I mean, and correct us if it's relatively new, at least in the US. In modular industry, as opposed to coming out from the mobile home industry or coming out from other industries, but really seeing a kind of limited scope. You're making the mod and someone else is going to be assembling it. Someone else, the owner GC team is really going to make those decisions. But do you see that growing? Do you see other business practices that are like that? I mean, like Factory OS, or do you see that?
Yeah, I think Skender is kind of like that in Chicago.
Yeah.
I was involved with a company called Capsys back in the 2000s and the 90s.
Sure.
They're out of business because their owner decided he's had enough and wants to retire. So
great company.
But Capsys was an offshoot of Monadnock Construction, and they were vertically integrated before that was really much of a term in the modular industry. So then that's an example of that. But I think that's going to happen more and more. And I've had other clients reach out to me, GCs and the like, reach out to me, and they're interested in setting up a factory and partnering with a developer or whatever, or just setting up a factory to do a project because nobody can find labor, and it's just a more efficient way.
Mm-hmm.
I want to thank Greg Sloditskie for coming and joining us here on this call. He's part of our network affiliate group, and happy to work with him on projects as well. Greg, you offer a lot of experience in this industry, and we really appreciate you spending some time with us and sharing that. This is ModX Network Voices, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you.
Thanks.